The night sky over the research station burned with the light of 3 falling stars. Dr. Marcus Webb looked up from his tablet and watched them streak across the purple atmosphere of Kepler 442b. They were beautiful, those lights. They were also the end of everything. "Those aren't meteors," said Private First Class James Okonkwo, stepping out of the habitat module behind him. The young soldier had sharp eyes and sharper instincts. He had been part of the security detail for 6 months now, and in that time, Marcus had learned to trust his judgment. "No," Marcus agreed, "they're not." The research station was small, just 12 people studying the alien ruins that dotted this distant world. They were scientists, engineers, and 3 soldiers meant to keep them safe from the local wildlife. Nobody had expected they would need protection from anything else. The lights disappeared behind the mountain range to the east. Marcus guessed they landed maybe 50 kilometers away, close enough to walk, close enough to run. "Wake everyone up," Marcus said. "We need to leave now." Okonkwo did not ask questions. He moved with the speed and purpose that military training provided, disappearing into the habitat while Marcus ran to the communication array. The equipment was old but reliable, a standard setup for frontier research stations. He punched in the emergency frequency and waited. Static answered him. Then a voice, calm and professional despite what must have been chaos on the other end. "Kepler Station 7, this is Colonial Defense Network. We have detected unauthorized entries into your sector. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately. Enemy forces are hostile. Do not engage. Run." The connection cut to static again. Marcus stood there for a moment, his hands shaking. Enemy forces. The word seemed impossible. Humanity had been exploring the galaxy for 3 centuries now. They had met 17 different species, traded with some, avoided others, but there had never been war. Not real war. Not like this. He heard footsteps behind him as the research team emerged from their quarters. Dr. Sarah Oduya was first, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes still clouded with sleep. Behind her came the others, pulling on jackets and boots, clutching tablets and personal items. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. "We're leaving," Marcus said. "Right now. Take only what you can carry in your hands." The 3 soldiers, Okonkwo, Corporal Maria Santos, and Sergeant Chen Wei, moved among the civilians like sheepdogs herding a flock. They were calm but insistent, guiding people away from the buildings and toward the tree line that marked the edge of the excavation site. "Where are we going?" someone asked. It was Peter, the youngest member of the team, barely 22 and on his first off-world assignment. "Away from here," Wei answered. "That's all that matters right now." They moved into the forest as the first explosion lit up the night behind them. Marcus turned to look and saw their habitat modules burning, the flames licking up toward the alien stars. Whatever had come down in those landing craft had moved faster than he thought possible. "Don't stop," Okonkwo said, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Keep moving." They ran. The forest on Kepler 442b was dense and dark, filled with plants that grew in spirals and trees that reached 100 meters into the sky. The undergrowth grabbed at their legs, and the roots tried to trip them with every step. But they ran anyway, 12 humans fleeing through an alien wilderness from enemies they had never seen. After 20 minutes, Wei called a halt. They gathered in a small clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their faces slick with sweat despite the cool night air. "What was that?" Sarah asked. "Who attacked us?" "I don't know," Wei admitted. "Command didn't give details, just told us to run." Marcus thought about the alien ruins they had been studying for the past 2 years. Ancient structures built by a species that had vanished long before humans left Earth. The architecture suggested beings much larger than humans, with technology that still worked after 1,000,000 years of silence. They had found weapons in those ruins. Weapons they didn't understand. Weapons they had reported to Colonial Command. "It's because of what we found," he said quietly. "Someone didn't want us to keep studying it." Before anyone could respond, a sound cut through the forest. It was high-pitched and electronic, like a machine trying to imitate a bird. It came from the direction of the station. "They're tracking us," Santos said. She had her rifle up, scanning the darkness between the trees. "We need to keep moving." "To where?" Peter asked, his voice cracking with fear. "There's nothing out here. We're 50 kilometers from the auxiliary site, and that's just a supply cache." "Then that's where we go," Wei said. 50 kilometers, we can make it." Okonkwo was looking at his tactical display, a small screen strapped to his forearm. His face was grim in its blue light. "Sergeant," he said, "they're fast. Whatever these things are, they're moving through the forest at about 30 kilometers per hour. That's faster than anything on this planet." "Faster than us," Wei agreed, "but not by much." Marcus understood what he meant. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but they had one advantage that no other known species shared: endurance. While other creatures sprinted and rested, humans could run for hours without stopping. It was an evolutionary gift from the savannas of ancient Africa, where their ancestors had hunted prey by simply following it until it collapsed from exhaustion. "We don't have to outrun them in a sprint," Marcus said. "We just have to keep moving until they can't." Wei nodded. "You understand. Everyone else needs to understand too." He turned to face the group, his expression serious but not unkind. "What we're about to do is going to be hard. Harder than anything most of you have ever done. But it's what humans do. We run. We keep running until our enemies give up or fall down, and we don't stop for anything." "But what if we can't keep up?" someone asked. "You can," Wei said firmly. "The human body is designed for this. Your muscles, your lungs, your heart. Everything about you is built to move across long distances without stopping. Trust your body. Trust each other. We're going to survive this." They started running again, this time in a formation. Wei led the way, setting a pace that was fast but sustainable. Santos and Okonkwo took the flanks, watching for threats from the sides. The scientists clustered in the middle, helping each other over obstacles and through difficult terrain. Behind them, the electronic bird calls grew closer. Marcus ran with the others, his legs already burning, his lungs already aching. He was 53 years old and had spent most of his life behind a desk. He was not built for this. But as he moved through the alien forest, something ancient stirred inside him. A memory encoded in his genes, passed down through 10,000 generations of survivors. His ancestors had run like this on the African plains. They had chased antelope across miles of grassland, never sprinting, never stopping, until the animal simply gave up and accepted death. It was called persistence hunting, and it was the reason humans had conquered their world. Now that same persistence might save them on another world, millions of light years from home. The first hour was the hardest. Marcus felt every step like a hammer blow to his joints. His lungs burned with the effort of processing the slightly different atmospheric mix. His mind screamed at him to stop, to rest, to give up. But he kept moving because the alternative was death. Around him, the others struggled too. Peter stumbled and almost fell, but Sarah caught his arm and pulled him forward. Dr. Chen, who was even older than Marcus, moved with a steady rhythm that spoke of long experience with physical challenges. The soldiers kept watch, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness, their hands never far from their weapons. And behind them, always behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued. The creatures chasing them never showed themselves, but Marcus could track their progress by the noises they made. The electronic calls, the crashing of undergrowth, the occasional flash of something moving through the trees. They were faster than the humans, but they were not tireless. After 2 hours, the sounds began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but growing more distant, more uncertain. The pursuers were falling behind. "They're slowing down," Okonkwo reported, checking his tactical display. Whatever they are, they can't maintain that pace. Neither can we, Santos pointed out. Her own breathing was heavy, her face covered in sweat. We need to rest. Not yet, Wei said. Another kilometer, then we'll take 5 minutes. They pushed on through the darkness, their legs moving on autopilot, their minds focused on nothing but the next step. When Wei finally called a halt, they collapsed where they stood, gulping water from their canteens and trying to catch their breath. Marcus lay on his back and stared up at the alien stars. Somewhere up there, Earth was spinning around a small yellow sun, unaware that a dozen of its children were fighting for their lives on a distant world. He wondered if anyone would ever know what happened here. He wondered if it would matter. 2 minutes, Wei said, then we move again. The night was long, but so was human endurance. The false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they finally reached the auxiliary supply site. It was nothing impressive, just a small prefab shelter buried among the spiral trees, stocked with food, water, and emergency equipment. But to the exhausted humans who stumbled through its door, it might as well have been a palace. Marcus collapsed onto a bench and tried to remember how to breathe normally. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, numb and disconnected from his commands. His heart was still pounding, and he could feel his pulse in his temples like a drum. Everyone made it, Santos reported, counting heads. All 12 accounted for. It seemed impossible. 50 kilometers through alien terrain in the dark with unknown enemies in pursuit. And yet here they were, alive and together. Wei was at the communication terminal, trying to raise someone on the emergency frequency. The static was thick, but occasionally a word or phrase would break through. Marcus heard quarantine and evacuation and enemy withdrawal. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. "I'm not sure," Wei admitted. "But it sounds like we're not the only ones who ran tonight, and it sounds like the enemy is pulling back." "Pulling back," Peter repeated. "Why would they do that?" Marcus had been thinking about that question for the last several hours. He thought he knew the answer. "Because they expected us to fight," he said slowly, "or to die. They didn't expect us to run." The others looked at him, confused. He tried to explain. "Most species in the galaxy, when they're threatened, they either stand and fight or they try to hide. That's what evolution teaches them. Running is for the prey, and no intelligent species likes to think of itself as prey. But humans are different. We know that sometimes the best strategy is to retreat, to conserve our strength, to survive long enough to fight another day." "So they weren't prepared for a target that wouldn't stand still," Santos said, understanding dawning on her face. "Exactly. They came down fast, hit hard, expected to catch us in our beds. Instead, they found empty buildings and a trail leading into the wilderness. And when they followed that trail, they found something else they didn't expect." "What?" Peter asked. "Us," Marcus said. "Humans. The only species in the known galaxy that can run for hours without stopping. They thought they were the hunters, but we turned them into the prey." Wei turned away from the communication terminal, a slight smile on his face. "I got through," he said. "Rescue ships are inbound, ETA 4 hours, and command confirms the enemy forces are withdrawing from all human settlements in the sector." A cheer went up from the exhausted scientists. People hugged each other and laughed and cried with relief. They had survived. Against all odds, against an enemy they had never seen, they had survived. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Someone had attacked human colonies tonight. Someone with ships and soldiers and hunting machines. And those someones were still out there, watching, waiting. The running wasn't over, it was just paused. He looked at his fellow humans, battered and exhausted but still standing, and felt a surge of pride. They had proven something tonight, something that the galaxy needed to learn. Humans were not easy prey. They did not give up. They did not stop. They ran and they survived. The sun rose over Kepler 442b, painting the alien forest in shades of gold and purple. And 12 humans, safe for the moment, looked toward the sky and wondered what would come next. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and confusion. The rescue ships arrived on schedule, sleek military transports that dropped out of the sky like fallen angels. Marcus and the other survivors were loaded aboard with minimal ceremony and maximum efficiency, the soldiers treating them with the careful concern usually reserved for fragile cargo. The transport's medical officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Park, examined each of them in turn. She found dehydration, muscle strain, and assorted minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. Most of the damage was the kind that rest and nutrition would fix on their own. "You're remarkably healthy, all things considered," she told Marcus as she ran a scanner over his legs. "Most people couldn't have done what you did. 50 kilometers through rough terrain at night with hostiles in pursuit. That's something." "We didn't have a choice," Marcus said. "Everyone has a choice. You chose to keep moving. That's what kept you alive." The transport took them to Gateway Station, the main hub for human activity in this sector of space. It was a massive structure, a city in orbit around a gas giant, home to hundreds of thousands of people from dozens of worlds. Marcus had passed through it many times over his career, but he had never seen it like this. The station was on high alert. Military ships crowded the docking bays. Soldiers patrolled the corridors in full combat gear, and everywhere he looked, Marcus saw civilians with frightened eyes, clutching their belongings and waiting for news. "It's like this across the whole sector," Wei told him. They were sitting in a crowded mess hall, eating their first real meal in days. 14 different research stations and settlements were hit that night. Kepler 7 wasn't even the worst of it. "What happened at the others?" Wei's face darkened. Some of them fought, tried to defend their positions, barricade themselves in. Most of those didn't make it. "And the ones that ran?" "Like us, most of them survived. A few casualties from the terrain or from being caught, but survival rates were much higher for the runners." Marcus thought about that. He thought about all the training simulations and emergency protocols that assumed humans would defend their positions, fight to the last, die with honor. And he thought about how those assumptions had nearly gotten his people killed. "We need to change our thinking," he said slowly. "As a species, we've spent so long trying to prove we're just as tough as everyone else in the galaxy. We build fortifications and stockpile weapons and train our soldiers to stand their ground. But that's not what we're good at." "So what are we good at?" Wei asked. "Moving, adapting, surviving. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the toughest, but we can go farther than anyone else. We can keep going when everyone else has stopped." Over the next few weeks, the picture of what had happened that night slowly became clearer. The attackers were a species called the Vex, a coalition of several related races who had been observing humanity for decades. They lived in the galactic core, far from human space, and they had developed a deep hatred for the younger species that was spreading across the galaxy's outer arms. The attack had been planned for years. The Vex had studied human behavior, analyzed their defenses, and designed their assault units specifically to counter human strengths. The hunters that had pursued Marcus and his team were called trackers, semi-autonomous machines built for speed and precision killing. They were designed to catch fleeing prey and eliminate it before it could escape. But the Vex had made a critical error. They had studied human behavior in controlled environments, in space stations and military bases, where people fought or surrendered but rarely ran. They had not understood that given the choice, given a chance, humans would simply keep moving until the danger passed. "They thought they understood us," Admiral Chen said during a briefing for the survivors. She was a small woman with gray hair and fierce eyes, the commander of the sector's military forces. "They studied us for decades, but they studied us in cages, in artificial environments. They never saw us in the wild." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. She had been quiet since the attack, processing the trauma in her own way, but she was still paying attention. "Now we fight," the Admiral said. "Not the way they expected, not on their terms, we fight like humans." The war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Vex expected humans to defend their territory, to build walls and dig trenches and wait for the enemy to come. Instead, human forces moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. They abandoned stations and settlements, fell back to new positions, and then fell back again. The Vex chased them across a dozen star systems, always arriving to find empty buildings and cold trails. And while the Vex were chasing shadows, human strike teams were hitting their supply lines, their communication relays, their fuel depots. Small groups of soldiers, trained in persistence and evasion, would slip behind enemy lines and simply keep moving until they found something worth destroying. They never fought pitched battles if they could avoid it. They just ran and hit and ran again. Marcus watched all of this from his new position on Gateway Station. He had been recruited by Colonial Command to help develop new survival protocols based on his experience on Kepler 442b. It was desk work mostly, reviewing reports and writing training manuals, but he felt like he was contributing something. The war lasted 3 years. In that time, humanity lost millions of people, thousands of ships, and dozens of worlds. But they never lost their spirit, and they never stopped moving. The Vex, by contrast, grew increasingly frustrated. Their carefully planned assault had turned into a grueling chase across half the galaxy. Their tracker units, designed for short pursuits, burned out trying to keep up with enemies that simply refused to stop. Their soldiers, bred for quick victories, found themselves facing an opponent that treated retreat as strategy and survival as victory. In the end, the Vex asked for peace. The treaty negotiations took place on neutral ground, a space station maintained by a species called the Harmonizers, who had made a business of mediating disputes between other races. Marcus was there as a technical advisor, one of many humans who had been invited to witness the end of the first interstellar war in galactic history. The Vex delegation was impressive, towering creatures with iridescent scales and eyes like pools of liquid mercury. Their leader, a being whose name translated roughly as Dominant Strike, spoke through a translator device that turned their clicking language into smooth human speech. "We do not understand you," Dominant Strike said during one of the sessions. "We are faster than you, stronger than you. Our technology is superior in every measurable way, and yet you defeated us." Admiral Chen, who was leading the human delegation, smiled slightly. "You didn't defeat us because you couldn't catch us, and you couldn't catch us because you didn't understand what we are." "And what are you?" "We're runners," Chen said. "We're the species that crosses the finish line after everyone else has collapsed. We don't win by being the fastest in the sprint. We win by still being on our feet at the end of the marathon." The treaty that emerged from those negotiations was favorable to humanity, though not as favorable as some had hoped. The Vex would withdraw from all contested territories and pay reparations for the colonies they had destroyed. In exchange, humans would share certain technologies and provide access to the alien ruins that had triggered the conflict in the first place. But more importantly, the war had changed how the galaxy saw humanity. Before the conflict, humans had been viewed as newcomers, a young species still learning their place in the cosmic order. After the war, they were seen as something else entirely. They were the species that wouldn't stop, the species that couldn't be caught, the species that ran until their enemies gave up. It was not the reputation humans had wanted. They had dreamed of being known for their art, their science, their philosophy. Instead, they were known for their stubbornness, their endurance, their absolute refusal to accept defeat. But as Marcus stood at the observation window of Gateway Station, watching the Vex ships depart for their distant home, he thought that maybe it was enough. Maybe being known as survivors was better than being known as conquerors. After all, survival was what humans did best. The galaxy was vast, and there were other threats out there, other species that might decide humanity needed to be eliminated. But now they would think twice. Now they would remember what happened when the Vex tried to hunt the humans. The humans had run, and they had won. Marcus smiled and turned away from the window. There was work to do, a civilization to rebuild, a future to create. And if that future required more running, more surviving, more refusing to give up, then that was exactly what humanity would do. It was what they had always done. 10 years after the war, Marcus Webb stood at the dedication ceremony for the memorial of the Long Run. It was a massive structure on Earth, a winding path that stretched for 50 kilometers through the mountains of what had once been called East Africa, the birthplace of humanity, the place where their ancestors had first learned to run. Thousands of people had gathered for the ceremony, representatives from every human world and dozens of alien species. The Vex themselves had sent a delegation, a gesture of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Marcus was 73 years old now, his hair white and his body worn from years of work. But when they asked him to speak, he stood straight and addressed the crowd with clear eyes. "We did not choose to be runners," he said. "Evolution made that choice for us, millions of years ago on the plains of this continent. Our ancestors ran to survive, to hunt, to escape predators, to find new lands. They ran because that was what life required." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Human faces and alien faces, young and old, peaceful and fierce, all of them listening. When the Vex came, they expected us to stand and fight. They expected us to die like warriors with our weapons in our hands and our backs against the wall. But we didn't give them what they expected. We gave them what we are. He gestured to the memorial path, stretching away toward the horizon. "This path represents the journey we took that night on Kepler 442b, 50 kilometers through alien forest in the dark with death behind us. Every step was agony, every breath was a struggle, but we kept moving because that's what humans do. The galaxy knows us now. They know that we are the species that cannot be caught, the species that will run until our enemies fall, the species that survives." He smiled, and his smile held echoes of all those years, all those miles, all those steps that had brought humanity to this moment. Some people think survival is not as noble as victory. They want us to be conquerors, to dominate the galaxy through force. But I have learned something in my years. Survival is victory. Every day we continue to exist is a day we have won. Our children will inherit a galaxy that knows humanity cannot be destroyed. Our grandchildren will live in a universe where the name human means endurance, persistence, the refusal to give up. And their children after them will carry that legacy forward into whatever challenges the future holds. We are runners, we are survivors, we are human. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was thinking about that night on Kepler 442b, about the fear and the pain and the desperate determination that had kept them moving. He was thinking about all the nights since then, all the runs and races and marathons of life that had brought him to this moment. Somewhere in the crowd he saw Peter, now a middle-aged man with children of his own. Sarah was there too, still vibrant at 85, still working on the alien ruins that had started everything. Wei had died 5 years ago, but his children were present, carrying on his legacy of service and sacrifice. They had all survived, they had all kept running. And as the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus took one last look at the memorial path. 50 kilometers of remembrance, 50 kilometers of human stubbornness and endurance and refusal to die. Then he turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady, his heart full of a quiet pride. The marathon continued. The race was never over. But humanity, as always, was still running. In the years that followed, the memorial became a pilgrimage site. People from all over human space came to walk the path, to feel the ground beneath their feet, to connect with the ancient inheritance that had saved their species. Some ran it competitively, setting records and pushing limits. Others walked it slowly, meditating on what it meant to be human. And every year, on the anniversary of that night on Kepler 442b, thousands would gather to run the path together. Young and old, fast and slow, they would move through the mountains as one, a reminder to themselves and the galaxy of what humanity could do when survival was on the line. The Vex watched from their distant worlds, no longer enemies but not quite friends. They had learned to respect humanity, though they never quite understood them. How could any species find pride in running away? How could retreat be considered victory? But they remembered the war. They remembered how their greatest military campaign had ended in frustration and defeat, how the prey they had meant to exterminate had simply refused to be caught. And they learned, as so many others would learn in the centuries to come, that underestimating humans was a dangerous mistake. Other species took note as well. The galaxy was full of predators and competitors, beings who saw the younger species as rivals or resources. But after the Vex War, they looked at humanity differently. This was not a species to be hunted lightly. This was a species that knew how to survive. Some called it cowardice, this human tendency to run rather than fight. But those who knew better understood the truth. It took courage to keep moving when your body begged you to stop. It took strength to survive when death seemed certain. It took something uniquely human to look at impossible odds and say, I will not die here. I will keep running until I find a place where I can live. And that was what humanity did. They spread across the galaxy, not as conquerors but as survivors. They found new worlds and made them home. They encountered new challenges and overcame them through persistence and adaptability. They built a civilization that stretched across 1,000 stars, unified by a simple truth. They were runners, they were survivors, they were human. And the galaxy, for all its vast indifference, would never forget what they had proved on that night when the stars fell on Kepler 442b. Speed had turned pursuit into survival, and survival had turned humanity into something the universe had never seen before. A species that would never, ever stop running.